Okay, it's 1 minute after 2, so let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here today, everybody, on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon. I hear it's beautiful. I haven't been outside since 8 a.m. this morning, so hopefully that's still true. I am Dr. Allison Boyer, Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning here at Collin College. And for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about something called trauma-informed instruction, which is not a term or a practice that I made up. It's a legit thing. And the reason that I wanted to offer a session focusing on this topic this semester is probably pretty obvious. The onset of COVID-19 and the global pandemic and the ways in which it's impacted all of us, including our students, of course. Those of you who attended the January Faculty Development Conference keynote session with Dr. Zadina might recall that she also talked about teaching during times of stress. And she offered a lot of great research and strategies that focused in particular kind of on the physiology of stress. So today, my plan is for us to just kind of build on that topic a little bit more and zoom in on some of the core principles of this practice called, trauma-informed or trauma-aware teaching, and some of the potential classroom strategies that can go along with it. So, but before we kind of dive in, I want to do just kind of a quick check-in with all of you. We're at a really busy time of the semester. I know this, so extra thanks for being willing to give a little bit of your time today to this topic. So I'm wondering, what is one word or phrase that describes how you're feeling today in this moment? Just take a second to think about that. And if you're comfortable doing so, pop something into the chat if you don't mind. Tired, busy, exhausted, overwhelmed. Yes. I'm going to add world weary for me as my descriptor today. Too much to do. Yeah, when you think about everything that's happened in the world in the last week alone, it's mind-boggling, isn't it? Yeah, so it sounds like we're all kind of on the same page. Unfortunately, this feeling of being tired and exhausted and overwhelmed. Though it is late, getting to be late March, I guess that's pretty typical for this time of the semester, in my experience. But thank you all for being willing to share some of that. This is just kind of a quick way for us to ground ourselves in this moment and acknowledge what we're bringing into the discussion today. And it kind of helps me take the pulse of the room, so to speak. And it's also something you could really easily do with your students, obviously, face-to-face or online, as a way to check in with them at the start of class or even at the end of class, and see what's going on with them. So we'll come back to this idea of check-ins during the session today, but this is something that I think can be really easy, but really impactful in the classroom or anywhere. So let's take a minute to just define what we mean by trauma in the context of this particular discussion. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration defines it as an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So as you can see, this term is a bit broader. This definition in particular is a bit broader than how we might define trauma in medical terms, obviously. The origin of trauma as we're conceiving of it here, does not have to be violent or abusive because it is centered around an individual's experience and how they interpret it. And it can have both conscious and unconscious manifestations. So two people could be exposed to the exact same events, but experience them in vastly different ways. So it could be a trauma-inducing experience for one person and not for the other person. Again, it's very individualized. And again, this idea of individualized experience and flexibility is something that we'll keep coming back to as well. So I want to hear from you all again here, keeping this definition in mind. What kinds of trauma have your own students experienced, or do you suspect that they have experienced, COVID related or not? Again, you can pop something into the chat if you feel okay about that. Divorce, that's absolutely a traumatic experience. COVID related deaths, unfortunately. Job loss, family illness, deaths, absolutely. Job loss is a big one, for sure. I've certainly had my share of trauma experienced students, including students who have had a history of suicidal attempts, a student who has had loss of a parent due to drug and alcohol abuse. I had another student who was diagnosed, officially diagnosed with PTSD. And quite frankly, some of these were when I was a very young, brand new college instructor. And man, I wish I had had some more training on the matter back then and was more equipped to contend with it rather than being surprised with it in the middle of the semester, which is typically what my experience had been with it. Yeah, so Nandini is sharing divorce, separation, physical abuse, self-harm, depression. Yes, all of those things. And think of, these are just the ones that we know about or suspect. There are so many other things that are likely happening in our students' lives that we don't know about or don't suspect. These are just the things that we might see on the surface. So what counts as trauma? Before we talk about that, I want to share a few statistics with you. Research tells us by the time they reach college, 66 to 85% of youth report lifetime traumatic event exposure, with many reporting multiple exposures. And what I think is really interesting is that college students are particularly vulnerable to experiencing new, potentially traumatizing events. As many as 50% are exposed in their first year of college, which I think makes sense when you think about this kind of sea change that college often brings with it. And if we're teaching older students, non-traditional students, they have even more of a chance of having some lifetime trauma behind them. So what does actually count as trauma? And I think you have all already shared prime examples of what can fall into this category. So we have things like death, loss of a family member, a partner, a loved one, a teacher, a pet, divorce, physical pain or injury, serious illness, things we're seeing right now, war, political violence, violence of any kind, natural disasters, domestic abuse, bullying, substance abuse, acts of terrorism. Again, some things we're seeing a lot of here: poverty, job loss, food insecurity, chronically chaotic housing or financial resources, witnessing death or violence, sexual or physical abuse or assault, systemic discrimination, having to move to a new location, abandonment, neglect, betrayal, military combat, and much more. These are just a few things. Again, we think back to that definition that trauma is very individualized, And it depends on how that experience impacts that individual and how they carry it with them. So it's a very broad definition. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list, as we bear in mind that definition that we've been talking about. But hopefully this list just gives you a sense of the different kinds of things that can cause trauma for our students and for ourselves. And thus the likelihood that our students have one of these experiences, even if we don't realize it. And honestly, just pause and think for a minute to ourselves, how many items just on this list alone have you experienced yourself during your lifetime? I can tick off 3, at least for me, maybe more than that. So, if we think about just ourselves and then we multiply that by the number of students we have, it's a lot. It's a lot, and it's most certainly affecting what's going on in our classrooms. And just to put the whole thing in perspective, here are just a few statistics about college students right now, only within the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic. 43% of full-time undergraduates are employed in some capacity, but then closures of restaurants and retail stores and those kinds of businesses have eliminated countless part-time jobs and full-time jobs. 38+% of college students lost future jobs and internships due to the outbreak, which I find really interesting. That's not something that I even thought of when all of this started, but that's a big deal. We have a lot of students and people who are struggling with food insecurity. And 51% of college students say they're experiencing mental health distress as a result of the outbreak. And one piece that I read that mentioned something really interesting was that this COVID experience, this global pandemic experience, is showing effects or can be experienced similar to radiating long-term trauma that people experience when they survive or go through a natural disaster, but also shows the hyperarousal and avoidance behaviors that can stem from human-caused events and disasters like terrorist attacks. And then you add to that the uncertainty that comes with this pandemic in terms of we don't know when it's all going to end or when it's going to go back to normal again, if it's ever going to go back to normal. So this is a lot. We are all going through a lot, and we've been going through a lot for over a year at this point. So how exactly can trauma impact learnings? That's kind of what we're focused on today. That's our main reason for being here today. And it is true, the experience of trauma can really have a profound impact on students' learning. Some of the consequences include challenges with memory, concentration, focus and attention, planning, the ability to juggle multiple tasks, decision-making, and creativity. These are all instrumental to the learning process. So that really is a profound impact that can happen on our students. But how can we recognize it in the classroom? What might we see in our own classrooms as a result of this impact? Some of the ways that it might manifest in our students include the tendency to miss a lot of classes or perhaps deadlines, challenges with emotional regulation, a fear of risk-taking, anxiety in general about things like deadlines, exams, group work, public speaking, any of those things that can happen in our variety of classes that we teach. Difficulty focusing, retaining, recalling information. We might see feelings of anger, helplessness, or dissociation when they're particularly stressed. They might seem withdrawn or show signs of isolation. We might also notice that they have some involvement in unhealthy relationships. And again, there are certainly other ways that it might show up in our classroom. These are some of the primary things that we can keep an eye out for in our students. So now that we know what trauma means in the context in which we're discussing it today, why we should be mindful of it in terms of student learning, and what it might look like in our classrooms, I'd like to take a look at the core principles of trauma-informed teaching as identified, again, by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And along the way, we'll consider some strategies that will help us work to achieve those principles and values as instructors. So the first core principle that they identify is the principle of safety, ensuring a feeling of cognitive, physical, interpersonal, and academic safety in our classes. A sense of safety is a baseline for learning and for living in general, right? If our students feel a threat in some way, whether real or perceived, higher order thinking will absolutely take a backseat to the brain's need to focus on self-preservation. Again, if you think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that physical safety is right there as the foundation. And a point that I think is particularly meaningful is that physical and emotional safety needs to be defined by those who have the least amount of power in the situation. And in this case, it's our students. So here are just a few things to consider, ways that you might go about creating that safe environment for your students. First, survey your students about how they feel, especially in your class. Again, remember how we did this at the beginning of our session. That's just one example. It took just a couple of minutes to do. It was super easy. You could also make it slightly more formal. You could implement an anonymous online survey with your students early in the semester or throughout the semester to ask them about specific things in the classroom environment or about the interactions that are taking place in the classroom to kind of, again, get a baseline for your students and what works for them. And keeping it anonymous is always another great way to help students feel safe, right? Because they're not having to disclose something very personal to you if they don't want to. It's also a really smart idea to work with your students to set some community guidelines, establish classroom norms about things like behavior, interaction with each other, heck, even the physical setup of the room if you're teaching in a face-to-face environment. So these guidelines could include really broad things like don't be afraid to ask questions, or they could be, really specific guidelines like say thank you, say please, or don't interrupt other people when they're speaking. Again, I think this is great practice in general for any reason, but it can also have even greater ramifications for any of our students who might be coming to our classroom with some trauma behind them. It can also be really valuable to reveal some of your own vulnerability, share some of your own stories to demonstrate your own feelings of safety in the environment and to humanize yourself a little bit. And yes, you might consider providing content warnings or what we hear called trigger warnings for students when teaching what you know might be difficult or sensitive material. Obviously, this will not apply to everything, but if you're about to dive into something that could reasonably be triggering for your students, like text or video about violence, for instance, students will typically handle difficult material better if they know what's coming. And if it is something that's triggering for them, they can let you know and you can come up with an alternative for them. So again, you don't have to have trigger warnings for everything, but it's something to think about. It's also absolutely crucial to let your students know that self-disclosure is their choice and is not a requirement for success in your class. They should not have to share their trauma with you or with the class if they don't want to. So don't make that a requirement in order to implement some of these strategies that we'll be talking about today. You'll of course want to be sure to pay careful attention to what's happening during class discussions, whether online or in person, to make sure that students are just being respectful of one another. You'll want to watch for any angry, aggressive, or combative students, intercede when necessary, model appropriate conflict resolution behavior if need be. And as you should always do, you want to make clear to your students how, when, and why they can contact you if they need help or if they want to report any concerns or just let you know what's going on with them. Again, generally good practice, regardless of who your students are. So the next principle is trustworthiness and transparency. A trustworthy learning environment is really crucial for supporting the learning process, and it helps place students at ease, particularly those who might be wary of trusting authority. There are several different ways that you can help build that trust with your students. First, offer predictability and consistency in your course through class routines. You can create these kinds of class routines and rituals that students know to expect by doing things like beginning and or ending class with a certain activity every time. You could also do things like posting weekly announcements that they know to look for, or giving them overviews at the start of class or a summary at the end of class. There are all different kinds of things you can do to create this sense of routine and predictability that can help put students at ease. Good organization is also really crucial and helpful in this sense, in building trust and providing transparency at the same time. A sense of structure can help diminish uncertainty and the anxiety that can come from it. I'm sure we've all been in a class that was really poorly organized at some point in our long academic careers. So I know I have. I am familiar with the anxiety that comes from that. So be really consistent and clear in your course policies, in your expectations for students, in the tasks that you want them to do as well, so they always know what's coming and what's expected of them. Again, just good practice in general. In terms of feedback, you'll want to ensure that it is kind, constructive, and supportive. It is, in fact, possible to be honest with students about areas in need of improvement without belittling or embarrassing them. Your feedback should leave them feeling encouraged and motivated and have a sense of what they need to do to improve without feeling broken or crestfallen about it. It is possible to do. You'll also want to set and maintain healthy, consistent boundaries with your students. Maintain a sense of professionalism with them, but also know this does not preclude you from being honest and human with them either. Again, you can have that sense of professionalism, still function as their teacher and they as your students, but still have a warm rapport with them and a positive relationship with them. And then finally, be transparent about course design and the decisions that have gone into putting the course together. Let them know the rationale that was informing those decisions that you made regarding things like course design, assignments, grading practices, even the selection of texts that you might include. Help them understand why you're doing everything so that they know that nothing is arbitrary, that there's a meaning behind all of it, and show that you're holding yourself accountable for those decisions. Pull back the curtain for them, so to speak. We know we have a reason for everything, or hopefully we have a reason for everything, and just share that with your students. Okay, the next principle is that of support and connection, not only with you as their instructor, but with each other as well in the class, to foster community and help them feel less isolated and more at ease with you and with each other. Peers in particular can represent people with shared experiences and perspectives for your students without that power dynamic attached that comes with the teacher-student relationship. So some things to consider include doing work early in the semester to help facilitate some relationship building amongst your students. This is especially important in the online environment when they are not seeing each other face-to-face multiple times a week. Create some opportunities for them to get to know each other. You can do this in a lot of different ways, like asking them to do self-introductions or activities early in the semester, whether it's in person synchronously or posting asynchronous videos or something like that if you're teaching online. You can also provide some space and time for them to connect with each other outside of the coursework through maybe an informal conversation space that you provide for them, maybe on your course, if you have a course website or your Canvas website. You could even do things like encourage them to identify a class partner or a class buddy for purposes of note sharing, but to also serve as another connection point in the class besides you if they don't know anybody else in the classroom. It can also be really beneficial to conduct regular check-ins with your students. Again, this could be through activities like we did at the start of our session today. You'll see that serves a lot of different core principles that we're talking about. But also by doing things like scheduling opportunities for one-on-one meetings or conversations with your students so that you are really staying in touch with what's going on with them and how they're doing in the class and let them know that you're there to help them and support them. If you are teaching in an online environment, you might think about offering some synchronous opportunities for connection. Again, not only with you, but with each other. These can be a really powerful tool for fostering relationships. Use them mindfully, however, since I know that these can be challenging for a lot of students for a lot of different reasons, but something to think about. Incorporate group work in your classes. This obviously is going to give students an opportunity to work together, even if informally, even if it's just through breakout groups, activities that they might do during a synchronous class session or an asynchronous assignment. You could put them in permanent groups that they keep through the length of the semester. That's a great way for them to really get to know other people. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you are connecting students with available institutional support by providing them with referral information for campus resources that might be relevant. You can do this in a really safe way by providing that information to all of your students. You could even put it in your syllabus if you want to, and just reminding them, making sure that they realize those resources are available to begin with. They might not even be aware of it. So just letting them know that they exist and this is how you can access them can be really meaningful. So here we are at the midpoint. I just want to check in with you. Are you doing okay? Do you have any questions at this point? I will take the silence as a nod to keep going. All right, the principle of collaboration and mutuality is next, and it asks us to reconsider the traditional teaching model of being the sage on the stage. You might have heard that phrase before, and instead welcome our students as partners in the teaching and learning process and kind of share power with them in the classroom. I know that can be scary for some instructors. But it doesn't have to be a scary thing at all, I promise you. There are a lot of easy ways to do it. You can share decision-making with your students by inviting conversations about what topics interest them. You might go back, review your courses, and look for points where students could have some input on the course content. And if there aren't any, could you add some? Perhaps they could help create a course assignment or vote on certain readings that they would like to see included in the course. They could help you draft some of the course policies. You can decide, what kinds of things you would feel comfortable letting students have input on, but there are a lot of different things that you could share decision-making with them on. You could also incorporate some student-led discussions and activities in your classes with guidance from you, of course. This can help further decenter some of the power in the classroom. And bonus, let them develop some critical skills and engage in higher order thinking in the process. So win-win for everybody. It can also be really beneficial to consider flexibility with assignments and deadlines, if you feel okay about that. If students get sick or stressed or something happens in their lives, they might miss class or turn in work late. This doesn't mean giving them a pass on those kinds of things, but mapping a workaround out up front can help you be prepared for those moments, and even let your students know in advance what they need to do to make up what they missed if they missed something. Solicit student feedback during the course rather than simply at the end of the class when it won't affect them in any way. But ask them during the class, during the middle of the semester, what feedback they have for you, what's going well, what's not going as well, to demonstrate that you value what they have to say. It doesn't mean that you have to promise to make any changes to the class based on what they say, but it certainly shows that you are interested in their opinion and collaborating with them in that way. You're kind of giving them a voice in their classroom environment, which can be very motivating for students. You should also encourage help seeking in your students. Teach them how, when, and why to advocate for themselves, because that's not something that's easy for a lot of people. Certainly not easy for a lot of our students. Invite them to ask questions and to tell you when they need more help with something, or if they need more instruction from you, or whatever the case might be. But again, kind of give them that permission to advocate for themselves if they need to, whether it's in your class or elsewhere. So next we have empowerment, voice, and choice. This is a really important principle here because it can help these students gain a sense of agency in their lives, in their education, in your classroom, when some traumatic experiences might make them feel like they are powerless. And I don't know about you, but this whole pandemic situation has certainly made me feel really powerless. So you can see how this could be really important for them. So one thing you could do is build in choices into the curriculum where possible. You could give them a selection of assignments to choose from, or readings to complete, to name just a couple of easy examples. You could even do something like giving them a choice on the kind of work they want to do in breakout groups during your class. So like you could say, okay, join group 1 if you want to discuss this topic. Join group 2 if you want to discuss that topic. You could give them a choice on the kind of information they want to share in class during a check-in. So for instance, during the check-in that we did at the beginning of the session, I just asked you to share how you were feeling. But you could also do something like give them a choice of what to share, like what's one thing that has brought you hope this week? What's something that's been difficult for you? What's something nice that somebody did for you? What's something tasty you had to eat this week? It could be anything. And again, that means they get to choose what they share if one of the prompts feels uncomfortable to them. And alternate assignments can be especially useful to offer when dealing with difficult or sensitive material, like we mentioned and discussed earlier when we were considering trigger warnings and content warnings. A couple of things to think about when it comes to this idea of building in choices. First, be sure to balance that choice with structure. Choice can absolutely help students feel more empowered and be more self-directed, but too much choice can cause students to feel overwhelmed or lost. Sometimes too many choices can feel crippling to students. So it might be that you give them, say you want to let them choose a reading for the course, give them a selection of 3 to choose from. Keep it limited, so limit those choices. Another suggestion that I thought was really helpful was this idea of scaffolding those choices by doing something like offering a most popular choice option for your students who might feel less confident in making a selection on their own. And I think about this kind of like when you go to a restaurant, remember when we could do that without feeling weird about it? And you open the menu and you see certain items on the menu highlighted as a customer favorite or a chef's choice or things like that. I really love that idea of applying that same framework to some of the choices we might give our students in the classroom. Next, you just want to make sure you're validating and normalizing your students' anxieties, stresses, and concerns. Just let them know that it's okay for them to be stressed out or to feel worried about something, even if it's about something that happened a long time ago. The reason we might not know about our students' traumatic experiences is because they feel like they're weak, or it's something that they shouldn't share with others or that they shouldn't be worried about. I know that I have felt this way myself. So letting them know that it's okay, that it's normal, that they're not a freak, that they're not crazy, that can be particularly empowering for our students. It can also be really empowering to build on their strengths and experiences in the class. Believe it or not, our students know stuff. They know things that we might not know. For instance, you might begin a lesson by asking your students to share what they already know about a topic. It could be just kind of like a big brainstorming session. Tell me everything you know about this term or what experiences you've had with this particular topic. You could also craft assignments so that students are encouraged to draw and reflect on their own life experiences. Again, kind of showing them that those are valued. Those are valuable things that they can contribute and build on. It can also be really useful to allow for breaks during class. Give students a minute or 2 to step away, to take a breather when needed. You can build these in to your class schedule. This could also be one of those routines that create predictability that we talked about earlier. Added bonus, this can give them a chance to, catch up on any potential distractions during class, like their texts or their emails. If they just have to have a minute with their cell phone or they're gonna die, you can build that in. So a lot of benefits for everybody here to allow for breaks. And as always, make sure you're providing a space for all voices. And a variety of opportunities for all students to engage, not just those dominators, whether it's in small groups, whether it's in individual writing, you name it. And also make sure you're not asking marginalized students to speak on behalf of an entire population. Still doing okay? You hanging in there? Okay. So another important principle is to always be mindful of cultural, historical, and gender contexts that inform student experiences and identity. Gosh, this feels especially important right now. It's always important, but again, thinking about all the things that are happening in our world right now, this is really important. We just need to be aware of the complexity of student identities and the varied experiences that they bring with them into our classrooms. We can't look at all of them as if they're the same. We can't overlook differences that are integral to their identities. We also need to be really mindful and purposefully include diverse representation and voices in our course materials, whether it's in the readings that we choose, the examples that we look at, etc. I think you all probably already know this, but representation matters. We also need to be aware of the very real presence of privilege, oppression, and marginalization in our varied students' experience, and stay mindful of potential biases or assumptions that we might have, that our students might have, that might even be inherent in our own discipline. Think about knowledge and practices that have been disregarded or excluded historically in your discipline. And one point related to this that I thought was particularly insightful is to be cautious of conversations around the idea of grit. You may be familiar with this buzzword, this idea of grit in higher ed. This emerged, several years ago, maybe five years ago or so, around the work of psychologist Angela Duckworth. And the overall gist of her work is that the ability to persevere plays a bigger role in student success than pure intelligence or talent. This is a massive oversimplification of her work. If you want to dig deeper into it, you can read her book called Grit. You can also watch her TED Talk, which is widely available online. However, I think what gets overlooked here, this notion of grit, can also discount systemic forces like racism and place blame on individuals who have a harder time reaching those pinnacles of success because of it. This idea of grit can sometimes be used to ask trauma survivors to practice this kind of chin up mentality that's just really not productive. So I thought that was a really insightful suggestion that I came across in one of my readings. You'll also want to make sure you monitor and avoid aggressions in the classroom environment. These can be a source of daily traumatic stress for many of our students and colleagues. So examples of microaggressions can be things like continuing to mispronounce student names even after they've been corrected, disregarding religious or cultural holidays or practices like scheduling a test on a religious holiday, reinforcing gender roles in the classroom through the tasks that you ask specific students to do. There's a huge laundry list of examples of microaggressions. So be mindful of those when you can in the classroom as well. And the final principle that's identified is recognizing and supporting resilience without fostering that chin-up mentality that I just talked about, as well as growth and change in our students. You want to make sure you're conveying optimism with your students in the classroom. Let them know that you believe in their ability to succeed and to meet high expectations that you set for them. Demonstrate that you care about their success. And again, that you're optimistic about it. Hopefully, if you believe in them, they'll believe in themselves too. You'll also want to emphasize strengths over deficiencies. Point out what students have done well in their assignments, if something went really well during class, and use strengths-based language when you provide them with feedback. So again, feedback, like we already talked about, it can be constructive and helpful without being unkind or shame-inducing. Also, encourage and help your students find a sense of purpose, if possible. You can convey your own passion for teaching, your enthusiasm for the subject matter. Provide them with opportunities to tap into that enthusiasm and explore their own passions. Why are they in school, for instance? What are their goals? How can you connect this work that you're doing with them in class to some of those dreams and goals that they might have? And how can you do that together and work towards it together? I think it can also be really helpful to have some specific examples of language that you can use. So here are just a few recommended language strategies, particularly for moments when a student might be struggling. So instead of saying, you shouldn't feel this way, say something like, I can see that you are feeling this way. And if none of these examples that are here seem to be helping, a go-to strategy can always be to just say, help me understand. Help me understand what's happening right now, what you're feeling, what you're struggling with, etc. Again, just communicate to your students that you're on their side. Obviously, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions that can come with this notion of trauma-informed instruction. So I just want to take a minute to confront and correct some of those. First, I think many might think that you have to operate as a counselor or a therapist for your students. Rest assured, this is absolutely not true. Teaching with a trauma-aware mindset does not mean that you need to or that you should try to do the work of a professional therapist. Absolutely not. You can be supportive and understanding of your students and cultivate positive relationships with them without wandering into that counseling zone. This is where that need for establishing healthy professional boundaries with your students comes into play. If you feel like a student is starting to treat you as a therapist, you can instead refer them to campus counseling services if you feel that they might benefit, or just share that contact information with them. Similarly, you are not responsible for and should not try to diagnose your students. Again, we are instructors, we are not trained for that, nor is it our job. Again, you can refer to them to campus resources and let them know what's available to them, if that's something that you feel would be beneficial. Another myth is that this trauma-informed lens suggests that you cannot give consequences for classroom or academic infractions. Again, not the case. There needs to be a clear understanding of the difference between consequences which are designed to teach, and punishment, which generally just relates to, making them suffer. But you can absolutely exercise both compassion and consequences to your students, and you should absolutely have both. And then finally, it might seem like you can't include any sensitive or difficult material in your course content, lest you upset your students. Again, not true. As you all already know, part of the learning process and higher education in general is to help students learn to think critically, to work with ill-structured problems, to engage in difficult dialogues. We can't shut down that process or avoid those conversations. That's all a really important part of learning and growth. However, just doing little things that can help keep students in the loop, letting them know what to expect in advance, can help ease that process and avoid re-traumatizing them. Okay, we have a few minutes left. I'd like to take a look at a scenario and see what ideas you guys might have, given what we've just talked about, all the talking that I've been doing for the last 45 minutes. So here's the scenario. You're hosting a synchronous session for your students in Zoom. Several of your students don't turn on their cameras. So what do you all think might be an appropriate trauma-aware response to this particular situation if you were the instructor? Think about it and pop a few ideas into the chat. Online bullying. Yeah, that could certainly be happening. Yes, remind them it's okay to leave their camera off if they're uncomfortable. Absolutely. Leave them alone. They might feel shame or vulnerable in their space. Yeah, students might not feel comfortable sharing their home setting for a variety of reasons. We don't know what's going on. Things like Zoom backgrounds can help with this, but that should be an option, not a requirement, right? Leah says, I usually say something like, it would be great if everyone could turn on their camera, but it's okay if you would rather not. That's great. That's a great way to frame it. Yeah, Tala says, let them choose what they want. Nandini doesn't require students to turn on their cameras. Several people share personal space with others. So she only requires audio participation. Yeah, Amanda does the same thing. I remind them to take advantage of the chat option just to have them engage. Yeah, those are great suggestions. I think it's really easy to get worked up about, well, they don't have their camera on because they're not actually here and they're just pretending they're here, or they're cheating, or they're doing something else. Yeah, that might be the case, but it might not be the case too. We can't rely on those assumptions. Seeing yourself on camera and seeing others at the same time can also be really difficult, especially for anybody who might have body image challenges. And Universal Design for Learning tells us that we want to make sure we're considering multiple means. So giving them other means of participation, like many of you have suggested, like through the chat or just through sharing audio, are great options to give them in this particular instance. So here's another one. One of your students is consistently absent, missing course deadlines, and has alluded to personal challenges. So what might be an appropriate trauma-aware response in this situation? This could be an online or face-to-face course, of course. Jonathan says this has happened to him. Yeah, it's difficult to know how to respond. So Christy suggests emailing to check in, say you hope to see them soon, and email them to make a plan to get back on track. I love that idea. Ask the student if he needs help, just check in through email. Just to touch base with them might be enough. Contact the student, what's it called? Emergency alert response, the EAR, to express concern about missed deadlines. That's a great suggestion, Nandini. Thank you. Patrick says, give them your phone number. Well, you know what? That's not necessarily a bad idea. Especially if we're working from home, we want them to have a way to contact us. Some instructors are comfortable sharing that information. Many are not. But that's not necessarily an off-the-wall option either. And there are also other apps you can use to contact them that don't require that you give them personal information. I don't have them, they're not coming to me. They're on the tip of my brain right now, but they're not coming to me. Yeah, kind of the important thing to realize here is that we are not trauma detectives, right? Google Voice, thank you, Brittany. It is a person's choice whether or not to share or name their trauma to anybody else. And it is not our job to sniff that out. We can assume the high probability that something's going on and reach out to them, like so many of you have suggested, if they need to let them to touch base, if they need additional support, and just let them know that we're a resource for them, not to force them into disclosure. And then again, remind them about campus resources. Let's see, Leah shares, I usually email and say something like, I noticed you've missed some classes and assignments and wanted to check in to make sure you're okay. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you. Yeah, that's great. That way they can share as much as they want, but at least know that I've noticed the absences. Yeah, that's such a great suggestion. That's great. Yeah, again, we don't need to force them into disclosure. We don't need to force ourselves on them. We don't have to try to figure out what's going on. Just be there for them and let them know that you notice and that you care about them. All right. So I just want to kind of wrap up this session with this quote that I really like. It's from an article by an educator who was also a trauma-experienced student herself. And basically, it just reminds us that there's no single formula for dealing with it in the classroom, that it's going to be different for everyone. So, you know, we may not be able to do all of the things that we've just talked about here today, but really, we just need to be flexible and do our best. And that's good too. We are at 3 o'clock right now. So that is the end of the time that I allotted. If you have any questions or want to discuss anything further, I am glad to hang around. If you've got to go, I get that too. So I just want to leave you here with a slide reminding you about the remaining CTL Spring webinars coming up. We have one on imposter syndrome on April 9th. Dr. Rachel Gunter is going to be talking to us about perusal, and then we'll wrap out the semester with a session on online discussions. So thank you to all of you for being here today. Thank you for your great ideas and input. And if you ever need anything, if you have any questions or need help, please don't hesitate to reach out to me by phone, by email, whatever. I'm always glad to hear from you. So thank you, everyone. Take care and have a great rest of your week.